As we continue our discussion of fiction this week in creative writing, we come face to face with a question that's been debated as long as there have been writers out there. So the question of which element drives the story more? Is it about having good, solid characters within the story, or is it simply about the moment-to-moment development of the plot? So which drives the story? The character or the plot in the end. So we'll look at these two elements. First, character as an element of fiction. A few historical milestones to note: that Aristotle, in his Poetics from the 4th century BCE, said that there were 4 aspects to a solid character. That the character was good ethically, the character was appropriate to the storyline that was being explored or developed, that the character had a certain likeness to human action and feeling, and that the character was ultimately consistent throughout the storyline. The character didn't change suddenly, radically within the story itself. These elements are what Aristotle argued gave us our sense of empathy or connection for the tragic hero in Greek drama. That good characters displayed these traits on the stage, and consequently later as fiction develops on the page as well. By the time you get to the 19th century, Émile Zola, the French writer, as a proponent of naturalism, would argue that characters need to be as human-like as possible. That Zola would argue in the end that a novel was kind of like a chemistry laboratory, that if you created characters that were real enough and natural enough, you could just drop them onto the page in a story and they would start to act like real human beings, and the story would kind of write itself if you could just pull the characters close to human interactions as possible. So when you wanted to explore a character's social world, the character would start to act on his or her own. For Zola, he believed that this ultimately kind of drove the story. British writers, particularly like E.M. Forster, started to think about the character that was a literary creation as well. And Forster always argued that the thing that really draws us to fiction is not necessarily the character's realism, but the character that we get to see into the character's hidden life, or the consciousness that the character has of the world, and how the character puts together an understanding of the world as we read. More recently, in contemporary writing, a lot of readers have become more fascinated with the idea of anti-heroes, right? The characters who are not necessarily good, but characters who have more kind of a complex relationship with how they understand themselves ethically in the world. You see this in kind of the depictions of Batman as they've changed over the last few decades. We're also similarly interested in liminal characters, whereas a character like Zola's idea, right? The character is locked up in conflict socially and personally. That we sometimes are interested in characters who kind of drift through the world bit by bit. And so those kind of characters can draw our attention as well and make for good stories. Conflict has always been has traditionally been a defining element for a sense of character. The basic question for a character is, what does the character want out of the world? And a really good story is one where what the character wants is at odds with the character's other wants. So the character wants A and the character wants B, but can't have both A and B. Then how does the character resolve that sense of conflict inside him or herself? These kinds of conflicts can play out in other ways as well. That you have the kinds of conflict you've discussed perhaps in stories from your earlier schooling, where the human being is in conflict with others, the human being's in conflict with self, with society, or the human being's in conflict with the environment around them, or nature, or even God or the divine. As the character works out these levels of conflict, the character defines him or herself and makes for a good story. I like to think about this as the idea of the story's economy. What's in short supply for the character, and what is that character willing to trade to have that thing that's in short supply for him or for her in the end? That's another way to think about the idea of conflict. And also you can think about conflict's definition within particular scenes. So, what's at stake within a particular moment in the story, within a particular space of the story, and what tensions are there. How does the character define him or herself against or within those tensions? In comparison, plot as a separate element of fiction can often seem very, very complex as characters develop. However, plot is very simple in the end in some ways. A friend always argues, right, that there are only two basic plots in the end. One is a man or woman went on a journey, and the second is a stranger came to town. Most excellent novels, you could argue, follow one of these two plot lines in the end. So you can think about Harry Potter. Which one of these stories is Harry Potter in the end? Plotting itself, though, wants to move beyond just a simple episode or anecdote in the end. It wants to have something at stake, something that's very important to the human beings who are engaged in the story, what larger meanings are at work within the plotting itself. Again, that's traditionally defined by conflict, but there is a link between those events. E.M. Forster, again, he draws the distinction between story and plot this way. You move beyond a simple anecdote where it's just a string of events happening. The story, like the king died, period, the queen died. Plot, very differently, finds a connection between the things, looks for cause and effect within the events of a story. So plot would be the king died, then out of grief, the queen died as well. The cause of the queen's death is the thing that drives the plot, as opposed to the simple kind of chronicle of one event after another. As these things kind of clarify themselves, you can kind of start to think about the points of conflict that are at work in defining the human relationships within a story. The Freytag pyramid may be the thing you're most familiar with in terms of diagramming a story, where you start with an introduction of the story, the main characters, and set up the exposition of the story, its basic elements and spaces. There's a period of rising action in the story where things start to percolate, where the conflict starts to develop to a point of climax where a character has to define him or herself within the story. There's a period of falling action where things eventually work themselves out to a point of resolution, or to use the other word, denouement, where things conclude by the story's end. That's the traditional plot of a short story. The question always is, does life really kind of follow this? Or is this, a literary model that interests us and excites us as we kind of think about how human beings interact and understand themselves? Plot is traditionally linear in structure, that things are linked by cause and effect in the end, that conflict and tension builds to a moment of climax where a character defines him or herself. Edgar Allan Poe always argued that a story should have a singular effect in the end, that it works towards leaving the reader with a simple emotion such as fear or anger or frustration or joy, whatever it is. And the plot, by building towards a sense of conflicts or towards a sense of climax, quite often there's a moment where the character has a flash of understanding, what writers will call an epiphany, a moment where life is clear to the character. And the question is, does life really work that way? If you're going to try to write about real life, does it really kind of follow that pattern? So some writers have started to complicate the linear plot, earlier than the 20th century, but certainly throughout the 20th century. They've used, instead of linear models, concentric models of storytelling. So a writer like Virginia Woolf, who tells stories in circles where characters move it around and around a central idea or feeling. They develop points of obsession or awareness and try to understand themselves against those central feelings. Some writers won't disarrange a sense of the linear plot. A writer like the Russian short story writer Anton Chekhov thinks about how does a story invoke a sense of mood within the reader. You can also think about the complexity of where does a story really begin or where does a story really end. If you were writing your own autobiography, where would you start it? Would you start it with your birth? Would you start it with your parents' story, your grandparents' story? Would you start it with your first conscious memory? Would you start it with yesterday? And then, work back and forth between those times. So plotting itself can seem very artificial. And that question of what makes a realistic plot, if you plot out, your basic consciousness, as stream of consciousness kinds of writers do, where they try to recapture every thought or sense experience they have, is that realistic narration? How do we as conscious beings filter certain things out as we make sense of the world? And so you can kind of complicate this in the end. So how do you develop a story if you begin with characters in the end? I would offer a few points of advice here. Number one, think in terms of a scene, like a staged scene. What's at stake in a particular moment or encounter on the stage? What is it that your characters are in conflict over, or what is a character in conflict over within him or herself? How does that move from the beginning of interaction within a particular space, a scene, to a concluding moment within that same scene? The question of whether conflict itself is too linear, don't be afraid to explore how an individual consciousness develops within a story. So, I always argue that obsession is, our feelings of obsession make for as good a story as any kind of conflict. So don't be afraid to explore the obsessive elements of a character in your writing, how a character acts upon irrational impulses such as fear or shame or desire. You see that in Bonnie Jo Campbell's characters and her fictions, and it's a really powerful thing when they come face to face with these things. And then finally, also think about, in terms of the story, is your story one of resolution, where a character builds a new understanding of him or herself or of the world? Or is this a process of disillusion, where a character is coming apart, or the world of a character is coming apart bit by bit? It's another good way to kind of think about, is the story building or declining ultimately in the end, as you sort out that difference between plot and character.